Hello, welcome to today's webinar. I'm Professor Mike Stewardson, CEO of the One Basin CRC, and I'm joining this meeting from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I'm pleased to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I invite everyone who's online today to enter the country that they're on today into the chat. I'll be chairing today's panel session, which is presented by the One Basin CRC, and it's in collaboration with Water Research Australia and the Australian Water School. The One Basin CRC is a 10-year collaboration of more than 90 industry, government, and research partners working together to solve complex water-related challenges in the Murray-Darling Basin. All right. So today we've got a fantastic panel. The panel today is asking the question whether Australia's water R&D capability is fit for purpose. And we're lucky to have a distinguished panel who share a common commitment to deriving positive societal benefits from water research. But they all work in very different areas. So I'm very pleased to introduce Karen Rouse, who has just completed 8 years as Chief Executive of Water Research Australia. We've got Professor Brad Mogridge, Associate Dean Indigenous at University of Technology, Sydney, and proud Murray from the Kamilaroi Nation. Professor Catherine Daniel, Interim Director of the School of Cybernetics at the Australian National University. Professor Seth Restra, Research Director for the One Basin CRC and Professor of Hydrology and Climate Risk at the University of Adelaide. And Associate Professor Guy Roth, Director of the Northern Region Agriculture at the University of Sydney's Narrabri campus. So welcome to you all. Let's get started. So we often think about research in terms of the things that researchers do in their research centres or laboratories, but for research to be useful, someone needs to use it. So we need to remember that the success of applied research is fundamentally about the whole ecosystem, including the researchers and the people who are involved in delivering impact from that research. So I want to start by exploring what this looks like in the water sector when it's working well. And so this is to start the panel off, we're going to look backwards at some specific examples. So I want to ask each of the panel members if you can give me an example where water research has had a big impact, and specifically describe some of the enablers that have led to that success. And Karen, I might start with you if you've got an example for us.
Thanks, Mike, and hello, everybody. As Mike mentioned, I'm the departing CEO of Water Research Australia. So speaking here as a private individual, I guess, and wanted to just give a little background. Water Research Australia was formerly the CRC Water Quality and Treatment, but for the last 15 plus years, we've been a member-based association funded by our members. So the example that I'd like to give is of our collaboration on sewage surveillance of SARS-CoV-2 during the recent COVID-19 pandemic, where we were able to support our members and the health departments around the country to stand up a program of sewage surveillance that helped to inform and target the health responses, and in so doing, save lives and protect the health of Australian communities. So how did we do it? We were able to do it through the relationships and the trust we built up over the many years of the CRC and then moving into Water Research Australia. We were an institution that had been around. So we had the staff, the structure, the ability to communicate and bring all these people together around a shared purpose. So shared purpose is always important to success. And in this case, it was one of public good. So it wasn't focused on generating research outputs like papers for individuals. It was really around the overall impact of the research and was achieved by what we call real-time research, where we were building actively as somebody was able to develop a test method or decide that or discover that it was possible to actually measure COVID within sewage. You think about that, that's an amazing achievement, a needle in a haystack job, that one. And we were able to do that over a very short period of time and stand up an effective sewage surveillance program. And an enabler for that was having all the parties in the room right from the start. So the health departments that would ultimately use it, the researchers that were able to generate the test methods, the laboratories that were going to scale them up, and the water utilities that had the knowledge of the networks and understood how it all fitted together. So, and what we've done now is been able to have foundations and to try and maintain that capability and capacity for Australia's future response to any pandemics, if and when they arrive.
No, thanks, Karen. It's a great example, because it was a rapid response. It was there's a very short time scale in which that response occurred in a period we probably all want to forget now. But it built on a really long time period of collaboration, building trust, as you said, the institutional support that was able to then be galvanized when it was needed towards that sort of shared purpose where there was sort of call to action. So, yeah, it's just interesting to think about those two different time scales at which that collaboration operated to be functional.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no, thanks, Karen. Guy, if you can, and I think you might have another example which also leverages a history of CRCs, a topic which is close to my heart.
Yeah, hi Mike, and hi everyone. I'm calling in from Narrabri in northern New South Wales, where we've just started our actual grain harvest, which is great. Probably harvesting one of our best crops ever, and the reason for that is we've had plenty of rain, and which is obviously water, so one of our best seasons. But the example I could think of was called Smarter Irrigation for Profit. Ran for 8 years. It was a partnership of rural research and development corporations, 4 or 5 of them, so 4 or 5 industries, close links with state government, universities and industry and farmer groups. But it had that longevity of 8 years, had that focus obviously on irrigation and many regions and good research teams, focusing on, at the time, what the issues of the day were in terms of obviously more efficient use and profitability. And the other one that struck me is more at the extension or adoption end of the RD&E line. And every state government had one of these. They were called Rural Water Use Efficiency Projects, programs. They all had similar sort of names like More Crop for Drop and Water Wise on the Farm and Water for Profit. They all had names like that. They pretty much ran in every state over 15 years or so in 3-year cycles, which was one of their probably enablers. But nevertheless, they were very successful programs. They all led to 10 to 30% improvements in productivity and efficiencies on farms. They work closely with farmers and agronomists or professional advisors. They were very regionally based. In this case, they were pretty well focused on irrigation, but in all the major irrigation areas around the various states. And, they were well-resourced in regional areas and well-connected with industry. So I think there's 2 examples of what I consider. I could think of plenty more, but they were great successes.
Yeah, so once again, so that longevity was important. The partnership was central to this, the partnership with industry, catalyzed by the program, which had a resource, backing it, and working across different regions, because it wasn't, these are shared challenges, although they have a distinct character in a particular place. There's commonalities across regions that can then be leveraged to deliver a greater benefit. And I think the key point you made there was that link to extension. So there was a pathway built into the program to deliver the impact from the research that was sort of in there from day one. Have I more or less captured those sort of the key messages there?
Yeah, that's right. And I think, the CRC program broadly has had quite an impact on that long term, particularly on the culture of researchers and teams. When I was a young fella, which was a while ago, it wasn't that common necessarily for organisations to collaborate, but it's very different now. There's a much stronger culture of collaboration. It's not always easy, but there is a desire at least to do that.
Yeah, good pick up the cultural angle. Turning to you, Brad, what's your example?
Thanks, Mike. Coming from Ngunnawal country in Canberra, and acknowledge their elders past and present. Yeah, look, I suppose going back a bit, we saw the National Water Initiative 2004 and created opportunities for some of the water research to happen. And, you know, aspects like the NAILSMA Water Policy Group in Northern Australia, we didn't have too much opportunity in Southern Australia. So we probably need a SAILSMA, different to NAILSMA, which is the Northern Australian Indigenous Land and Sea Management Alliance. I think we're trying to negotiate that now. And so I suppose the National Water Commission had, you know, funding that funded a lot of projects. We moved a bit forward to the Murray-Darling Basin Plan, and it was building on credible evidence and best available science, and Indigenous people never had anything. And so that's why we got regard in the Basin Plan. I regard a lot of things, and it's a very soft word, so I suppose that's where we're at. And then there was no sort of opportunities to actually fill that void. And until MTBA and I think National Water Commission put a little bit of money into it as well, was the Cultural Flows Research Program. And, you know, that was a body of evidence and methodology and things like that provided Indigenous people to build a model to actually model cultural flows. So that's there. And then I suppose my push was trying to fill a void for my mob, there's no Indigenous research methodologies aren't really part of research. And I think that was the void I was trying to fill with some of my research. And, that's something that the mob can actually bang on the table now rather than having nothing at all. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Brad. Really highlighting that the sort of the role that funding plays. I mean, this work, it costs money. And that there needs to be a model. It could be from different sources, but there needs to be a sort of a funding model to support activity if there's an expectation that that's going to occur. And then the sort of the evolution of this over time. Guy talked about the sort of development of culture, and you're talking about sort of methodologies as well. That's part of that. This doesn't happen overnight. It goes back to Karen's point, the gradual build up of capacity, through sort of longevity. Yeah, no, thanks, Brad. I can see a great question coming in from Max for you, Karen. I'll come back to you on that one because it's a good counterfactual question. But Seth, if you've got something to add.
Sure. So the example that I was going to pick was really the research spanning many decades that link climate variability, climate change to what's happening with hydrology, floods and droughts and so forth. I guess one of the things that I think was really important there is Australia's just been leading the world in this area for many decades, and it's been leading the world in fundamental research, that sort of discovery research, but also the application and the operationalization of that research, whether it's in sort of seasonal forecast products, that we've been very, very sort of ahead of the curve on that, and the Bureau and so forth is doing that. Also, policy at that sort of the longer term level. So I was participating in a webinar on this very platform just a few months ago around Engineers Australia adopting much stronger climate change guidance around future flood risks. So there's a lot of examples of how that research, I guess, is propagated now into different tools, methods that are run by governments, by, engineering bodies and so forth, and actually being used, to make decisions now. So I think that's really interesting. And I guess I'd sort of say that there's four sort of key enablers. One is, and this is probably in common with the other examples, is that there was a lot of social license and a clear visible need. I mean, we're, the land of drought and flooding rain. So, you'd think you'd spend a lot of investment on understanding that. And so it was quite easy to tell the story and the narrative of why invest. I think the longevity of the investments, which, points to, this idea that there's researchers, and knowledge being passed through generations of researchers in that space, I think it's really important. So it's not something that you can spin up overnight. We've been leading the game in this area for a very long time. I think in terms of the application and the impact, it's the sophistication of our end users or next users. So I think there's, whether it's the Bureau or Engineers Australia or various other organisations have a lot of sophistication in working with researchers in terms of how to adopt that information and that sort of toing and froing. And I guess the final thing is a real diversity in the community. So it wasn't just a single program. It was, some grassroots research, some discovery-led research, some large Commonwealth-funded research, by a lot of different agencies over that sort of many decades.
No, thanks. That's the longevity, a key theme there. And I like that cultural piece around it's about people, that transfer of knowledge through different generations of researchers. This has been underway for long enough to see that happening, and senior researchers who build a culture of collaboration, handing that on to the next generation, but that requires some continuity of engagement in that research space for that to actually occur. And I think that's the point that Brad made in terms of Indigenous researchers, is that needs support to kind of build that cohort of research leaders up. So there is then that ability to pass that on. I might just turn back to you, Karen, because I love Max Finlayson's question, because it's a kind of a counterfactual. Let's imagine you didn't have that history in place at Water RA that goes back 20 years or so. You actually wanted to respond to the COVID detection challenge. It was there was a sharp call to arms to do something. What would that look like from where you were sitting at the time, Karen?
Thanks, Mike. I think that it would have been attempting to do the same in the compressed timeframes. And in fact, one of the things we learnt from COVID is that you can build relationships and trust online. I think the prevailing wisdom has always been and continues to be that face-to-face is far better, but absolutely it can be done online and from scratch. And it's around the common purpose and the common goal and seeing the shared problem issue from all those perspectives. So, plug for Water Research Australia, I guess, is that's how we start all of our research efforts with, what is the problem? What is the issue? What does it look like from the different perspectives of those, end users, researchers, etc. And that's how we kick off our efforts. So I would imagine we would do the same, albeit quickly.
But Karen, you've started research partnerships and you shared those before. I mean, and are familiar with the sort of that startup phase where there is a need, a bit of a dance involved in building understanding. Do you think that would have been, how quickly could have that spun up without that sort of history? Is that, how much sort of relationship capital did that history kind of provide to accelerate that quickly?
Huge amounts. If we look internationally at what happened in the other countries, where the water sector was not so heavily engaged. So in the other countries, there was a lot, it was driven mainly from the health departments, whereas in Australia, we actually had not just the health departments, but the water utilities and the universities. So really the partners from that former CRC and members of Water RA all working together. And we were able to do the sewage surveillance differently to the other countries. We were fortunate at the start, at least, that we didn't have massive amounts of disease. We were really looking to find that needle in the haystack on very low case numbers. So it was very much groundbreaking research to be able to do that. So we were able to develop an application that was a global first. They were all busy. They had, very many more cases. So it was much easier to find, test methods much easier to develop, et cetera, et cetera. So, absolutely.
I'd love to dig into that further, Karen. We could do a whole webinar, I think, just on that particular project and learn a heap from it. It would be fascinating. So maybe we can come back to that at some stage. Okay, so look, moving on a bit to think about, where we're at now. So it looks to look back now. Where are we now? There's a strong history of collaboration in water research in Australia going back 30 years. We've talked a bit about that. Have we done enough research? Are we reaching diminishing returns? And we've already heard about some of the emerging needs. Perhaps, from your perspective, panel, what's the single greatest water research challenge that we're facing over the coming decade? And are we ready to face that? Like, what sort of shape are we in to face that challenge now? And Brad, maybe because you've already started on this a bit, maybe I'll start with you.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, look, I think, we certainly found out with the release of the last State of the Environment report that there's a lack of data and information and potentially research. The National Water Agreement principles, I think they're a bit fuzzy. I don't think that's going to do too much. We found those opportunities, and I think, the science priorities that the Australian government released, the University Accord, especially in the Indigenous academic space. We've got a Murray-Darling Basin review coming up in 2026, the Water Act review in 27, and potentially there's a drought around the corner that we're not ready for. We don't know how to deal with drought. Australia is all the talk, and I think Seth mentioned, the land of flooding rains and droughts, so I think there's, we've had two of the worst on record in the last 20, 25 years. We've had a few good years with La Nina popping up for 3 or 4 years, and how do we're not ready for a drought. So I suppose that research challenge that's going to hit us, from my perspective anyway, is that I think with the long-standing relationship Indigenous people have with the Australian continent, we're not accessing that bucket of knowledge. It's been pretty much passed off as myth and legend, so I suppose it's not in the space as evidence, if you know what I mean. So yeah, look, I've got projects that I've had to derive myself, looking at cultural indicators and drought resilience, with CSIRO, a little project, but they're only little projects, but they could lead to bigger things. They could advise on drought policy, but, you can't get the buy-in at a bigger level. Everyone will want a piece of it when we come up with it, but at this stage, yeah, you're funding it out a small bucket. So I suppose that's a big challenge, and the aspect of building academic pathways, I think that'll lead into the next question as well for me as well. Yeah, for Indigenous people. Yeah.
Yeah, that the difference between a fragmented research community, which is really good fragmentation in funding, and a sort of sustained programmatic perspective is just fundamental. The two might actually look the same in terms of the funding that's required, but in terms of the ability of researchers like yourself to actually plan, deliver, build capacity, build relationships is just, it's curtailed by a sort of a year to year, where you're really looking for, you're reacting to where the opportunity is.
Yeah. And you're on 45 different things, committees and advisory groups. Yeah.
It's not a very good use. Some of that's necessarily use with the expertise that sort of, but you kind of have to be involved in it, I think, to really see that. I think from the outside, they look, they can people can just assume they're the same thing, but they're worlds apart. No, thanks, Brad. Catherine, what about you? You've got some thoughts about some of the...
Yeah, thanks, Mike. I think I was quite interested in your first question as well, so I'm only going to answer the first question and then go to the second one around...
I missed you at the start.
That's okay. No problem at all. Because I think, what's enabled that impactful research in the past, like many of the other speakers, I think we've had some really interesting and amazing programs in Australia's history that we've done really well at and that have had broad impact. One of them goes to the methodological research around how we connect policymakers and decision makers with communities. And this was, I think, part of the basis of the really long running Land and Water Australia program, but it was also embedded through CSIRO and through a range of universities, and particularly around how we do integrated catchment management or participatory methodologies that help to bring some of those different perspectives around place and space together. And I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal country as well, like Brad, and that those place-based knowledges, I think, are something that Australia did start to develop many years ago and did a really good job with. I think in this participatory area, one of the really core parts of that was also that we worked with groups from around the world. So this international part of our Australian research knowledge system is a really important one, because sometimes, we'll be at the frontier, as Seth was saying, and sometimes other groups will be, having those same kinds of challenges because of the kinds of contests or conflict they're having. Water is a very contested and conflict-ridden space. And so some of the enablers of that kind of research, really long-term program, were things like joint appointments between countries, joint PhDs, exchanges, study tours, global and local workshops, identifying and coordinating solutions, and then, trying to, I think at that point, they were enabled by both the political, the institutional, and the policy settings. I think towards the end of the Millennium Drought, we saw a change in some of those settings that moved from a more collaborative approach in some areas to a more distributed, we'll divide off the water, we'll go into markets, we'll divide out the land, and that did create some challenges. I'll leave that bit there and then move on to your second question around the enablers and the future aspects. One of the really big challenges that I see, and that I think Australia will have to invest in the water area really soon, is the linkages between artificial intelligence, the boom we're currently seeing, water, and climate. I think Australia is already doing pretty well and putting a lot of money into AI solutions for, improving our efficiency in the ag space, in water utilities, a range of others. I'm a little bit more concerned about what goes back the other way. So the water and impacts on country, impacts on climate change around building huge numbers of data centres, the energy systems we're going to need to power this particular thing that, again, needs water. So I think we're back in a stage where we're going to need knowledge around those integrations between, energy, water, ag, data, country, people, and the kinds of, imaginations and desirable futures that we want under those settings. And that's going to require, again, that connection of community and policymakers and decision makers. And so rejuvenating some of our capability that is still there. So a bit like what Karen was saying, a lot of these systems were built up over time. They're a little bit dormant, but they could be pulled out relatively fast, but there'll be new connections in this domain that will also have to be made, particularly with new industries.
No, thanks, Karen, for both those answers. I think it's a really interesting area, this sort of AI area. I mean, I myself have just signed up to work on an AI tool for note taking and so on, and I do it without even thinking about the environmental impact of that tool. It's clearly an area where we need to understand more about what those impacts are, and then what's needed in an area of the policy development. Clearly, it's individual level. It's pretty hard to sort of, manage those impacts. So, a really interesting new area, which is just not on the radar at the moment, but you can see it's coming. Thank you. Another question that's come through too, is in your role as director of the School of Cybernetics, is around PhD students, and it's actually from a PhD student who feels a bit disconnected from industry. And I know the experience of PhD students is really different in different schools, and I'm sure in your school you're quite focused on the experience that the PhD students get, because I know how you guys work. So can you just maybe give your thoughts on that, just reflecting too on Seth's comment about this sort of intergenerational transfer of the culture around collaborative research and driving impact from research?
I think, just like Seth said, it's something that needs to be built and maintained. If you miss a generation, that has impacts down the and so in the School of Cybernetics and in many of the other groups that we work with, including the Institute for Water Futures at the ANU, it's about building cohorts of students and linking them to work that is going on out in the real world, in industry, in agriculture, in Indigenous communities around the world. So with the One Basin CRC internationally, we currently have a couple of PhD students who are joined into an international network on water research for PhD students around the world. And so they're exchanging those kinds of their knowledge to make sure that they have these connections, and also that we don't de-skill our PhD students by putting them in a room and not letting them out, because they actually lose often many of the water researchers. We're extraordinarily lucky to have people who come in after practice. So we have people who come in from industry, we have students who have been out either as policymakers or others, and so making sure that we don't de-skill them. We skill them up in writing papers, but not necessarily in being able to collaborate with someone or to leave their office or to be in a workshop and contribute effectively. So I think making sure in all of our water research and other integrated programs across the sector, we do need to prioritise these connections, whether it's with community, industry, government, international organisations, to make sure that the people who we're developing have all of those skills that will make them ready for the collaboration in the moments where we need them to work together.
Yeah, no, thanks, Catherine. And you still hear occasionally, academics or, research groups saying that, we don't want our PhDs to be distracted from their project, but that's getting more, rarer and rarer. And you don't hear it from the PhD students. They're really keen. They see where their career is heading and the need for those relationships, and just a desire to actually see value from their research drives them, into these discussions and collaborations. So, yeah, no, I think it's such an important aspect of the work senior researchers do in supporting the development of the next generation, about the collaboration. Again, you need the continuity to make that happen. Karen, have you got some thoughts on this one?
I do, around the challenges, but first I'd just like to comment on the student programs. Water Research Australia has a very strong student program, our research leadership program, where we bring together our PhD and master's students across a broad range of topic as a peer cohort. So they build relationships there, but they also then become part of our alumni. And that was also instrumental in our Colossus project, because the alumni interacts with the current student cohort and just grows. So it's a really effective way of maintaining that capability and building those networks and links. But the challenge that I was going to speak to today is around climate change adaptation and water's central role in that. And I think we heard from Catherine about some of the less obvious ones. But really, water is central either in a direct or indirect way to pretty much all climate change adaptation. And it's driving the need for efficiency and more circularity. So efficiency is always the first go-to place. And we heard before that there's room for, lots been gained in agriculture, but there's, still room for more. And also I'm conscious of a question in the chat where someone asked, is there a need to rethink because policies that were in place before, may not be working now? And I would be saying, absolutely, we can say problems have been solved, and sometimes people will say a lot of investment's been made into water research over the last, however, pick a time, 20 years, 30 years. But questions don't stay answered. We'd like them to. We'd like it to be a once-off process, maybe, but they don't. And the situation changes, the environment changes, and the interactions between sectors and players and policies change, and we do have new knowledge needs. So the one that I was going to focus on related to climate change adaptation was the need for circularity, more water recycling, for that to be safe, so that the responsibility of the water suppliers and then responsibility of the water users and regulators can all, be considered together. And so it does bring in the need for more transdisciplinary and cross-sectoral approaches to research. There are some institutions and initiatives such as One Basin and another CRC solving antimicrobial resistance in agriculture, food and environment is another sort of new example where it's quite brave, I feel, to bring together so many sectors around such a challenging issue with severe consequences if we get it wrong for all of those sectors. So it's a very difficult space to work in, and I'm not sure we've got all the models we need. I feel that as we move into a more interconnected and circular approach to how we do business and solve problems, that this is an area of research challenges, but also challenges around how we structure our institutions and programs and funding. And just, I would say maybe, in the past, we'd always say, follow the money. I think maybe in this sort of situation, we should be following the water so that we don't have separate, agriculture or whatever based programs, but we actually think a bit more holistically with water as the interconnecting element.
Really nice place to finish that comment on that. So the ability for water to connect across a whole range of things. The CRC for water sensitive cities is an example where that was used as the sort of the platform, if you like, to talk about a whole range about the urban development issues, which were pressing, but with water being the kind of the way into those broader challenges. Interesting. It's good. Some good questions coming through. But Guy, what have you got for us?
Well, I think that's the issue is obviously the rising demand for water, which is a finite resource, and all the complexities and interaction and competing needs is a really grand challenge. And in agriculture, it might be water and climate, energy, labour and soil management. All these things come together. But water's, at the end of the day, still the most limiting resource for much of agricultural and regional Australia, regional towns. It is a major constraint, the major constraint. And, yesterday I had some school kids here and we were talking about photosynthesis. It's just so fundamental to life, CO2 plus water, And I think if we could, we need to somehow elevate water discussion, which is part of no doubt the objective of this webinar, but it's just so fundamental to many things that we do, not only in Australia, but internationally. We've got common problems. Now, one of the grand challenges, if you like, that I see is, evaporation from water storage. It's the largest loss of water on farms. Now, we're not going to be able to reduce evaporation out of every dam and channel. We don't need to, but even if we could find some and reduce the evaporative losses, that would be a significant saving. Say on a town water supply or some dam like that. And we don't have a solution for that at the moment. So there is market failure. So therefore there's a need for research. And we're definitely not alone with that problem. It's a global problem. And that's just one example.
No, it's a good point. And you think also that agriculture and the way it connects across the topics we're talking about too, that whole system, is a really, it's a really interesting example of the need for collaborative approaches like we've seen in the past, and you mentioned a couple of those before, to bring the scale of effort that's required to shift the dial. And it's not just the researchers, it's the extension providers, it's that link to technology providers. You talk about farm dams and evaporation, there's policy issues around that. So very quickly, these issues that sound like very focused things turn into complex, large. Not complex is perhaps not quite the right word. They're large problems that engage a number of different stakeholders with different sort of roles. So yeah,
I mean, on the people side, we're probably in the next few years. I don't have any data, but I do believe there's been a declining capacity and capability over time, not deliberately, but there is. And when we have kids here, for example, they want to see drones flying around and that sort of thing. But I do think as a research sector, we do need to continually work on developing more skills and capability in the water agenda going forward. It's part of our long-term strategy.
Thanks, Guy. Seth, finishing off with you, what's your perspective on where we're at and what the challenges are in the future and how well positioned we are? We've had a few questions come in. There's one here from Mark Bailey around nexus between energy and water. I don't know if that's an element there that you might pick up as well.
Look, I mean, I think there's a range of challenges, and I think in some way it would be quite dangerous to pick one, because I think it's clear that we need to work on a large number of fronts at the same time. And I guess I wanted to pick on a comment about, why is the R&D, funding landscape, becoming fragmented, and turn that actually into a bit of a discussion about a possible challenge for our sector. And the metaphor that I'd like to use for that is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which some people will know is this idea that human needs forms a hierarchy where the first is kind of these basic physiological needs like food and water, and then you sort of move up, a hierarchy. And I think if we to use that metaphor for water, there's a direct mapping on that first rung, right? Physiological needs, we need water. Guy, you sort of mentioned that's a fundamental human need. We need food, and food is, completely connected to water. So there's an absolute, essential, connection there. The next one is really around safety. And I think there's a lot of dimensions between water and safety. It's, things like water security, that you turn on your tap, that it works, a whole range of other things there. And I think those two, they're not, I wouldn't call them solved problems, but we're quite sophisticated now. There's been a huge amount of research, and to some degree they're addressed. And I think, we can find exceptions. There's people, in Australia that still don't have access to higher quality water, for example. Climate change is a threat to that, but as well. But, to some degree we've addressed those. And those ideas, there's often very clear metrics for how we define success, water use efficiency, how reliable the engineered system is, all those sorts of things. Now I think we're moving up, in some way the higher rungs, and in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they talk about things like self-actualization and so on. I think in the water context, I'd use words like sustainability and resilience to mean the same things. It's really that question of what sort of country do we want? What's the right balance, between different needs and so on. And it comes to the fact that because we've achieved so many of these kind of gains already, the next round of research and the next round of problems are actually quite a lot more tricky, because they're really going to be challenging discussions about how do we have trade-offs between sectors, how do we kind of achieve balance, how do we kind of manage these kind of complex risks and so forth. So I guess where I'm going with that is I think as researchers we need to start having that discussion about, we've achieved all this in water research. The next round of challenges, which sort of touch on that sustainability and resilience theme, are sort of qualitatively different. They're different in character, and they're harder to kind of put your finger on exactly what it means and what the benefit is. But it's clear that we need to go there, because we realize that we're not in a sustainable, scenario at the moment. And, I think there was discussion earlier about the next drought. We're not prepared for it. So we're not, we don't have that resilience built in yet either. So I think that's actually, it's sort of a meta challenge. It sits over the top of all these other challenges. Is we need to start having that conversation of where do we need to take water research, and how does it fit in with this broader narrative of the sorts of things that we want to achieve in Australia.
Thanks, Seth. Thoughtful contribution to finish on. Can I now, we looked at the past, look at the present, let's look where we're heading, because the present's a little bit depressing in this space. Let's kind of think about what might be the positives, the opportunities into the future, and particularly what kind of changes you think are needed for water research landscape. And I mean that broadly to include the whole ecosystem, including those driving impact from that research, the extension officers and others. What's the change that you think needs to happen to that ecosystem so that Australia is future ready? And we've had some good questions come through which link to this as well. So I'd encourage you to kind of harvest from there in responding. I'll try and pick them out as I go. I'm struggling to listen and handle all the questions, but I'll do my best. So maybe if we start with you, Catherine, and your perspectives on that.
Well, I think one of the big opportunities that we have is to better embed some of the key water considerations into our national, state level organisational research strategies. Because if those key questions or challenges that many of us have already outlined are in those strategies, there is an impetus to then monitor, evaluate, put the governing structures around those. And so I do think at the national level, checking where our structures are at and seeing whether we do need, my suggestion is yes, additional investment or at least coordination of a governing structure that will support water research, whether it's a National Water Commission 3.0 or an equivalent or a new form of a Land and Water and Energy Australia, something that's going to help to embed these things into our institutional settings, I think are really important because they also provide incentives for people then to work on them. Because lots of people in the research area, in research, can choose to work on water, they can choose to work on ecology, they can choose to work on energy, they can choose to work on defence or drones or whatever they might feel like. And so being able to say this is a priority, we believe Australia requires investment because it's one of those fundamental needs for the benefit of all of these sectors, for our ongoing security, sustainability, resilience, all those words that Saf was talking about. I think that's really important. The other part that I think is really important is that we need to make sure that our sector and the research landscape remains internationally connected and global. I do think sometimes we can be a little bit too insular, and a lot of research and innovation is about ideas. We have an idea, someone else has an idea. It doesn't mean we lose that idea. It means we've got two at the end. And often that's a really great way of building our research capability and exchange. And we've had some excellent examples of where Australia is leading the world in things. There are excellent examples of where other countries are leading the world in areas that could be of real benefit to Australia. And I think trying to develop twinning programs where we recognise that there are areas of capability that we don't necessarily have, but we know we want, would be really helpful. One example could be that in the Rhone River in France, they have had an integrated energy, water, agriculture communities way of managing that basin for decades. And that includes thinking about the questions I saw in the chat around hydrogen technologies, around the problems and challenges of nuclear, around how you put data centers on a river that's already too hot in summer, on how you might use solar panels and wind and pumped hydro within that system to enable the agriculture, how they use panels, for example, to shade and reduce evaporation in agricultural settings and to support community gardens and development, all those kinds of things. So I think we could think quite strategically at a national or even at our own different levels around how we think about those. And a lot of that is also to do with how do we train up, as we mentioned, those next generations. And I think the really big skill shortage that I'm seeing in the areas that I'm working in is around that critical systems thinking, critical systems doing. So how do we bring different perspectives, different ways, different facets, and break down some of the silos that I think, although they've been great for some parts of water efficiency or for some things, the challenges that are coming that we're going to have to lead, change through complexity and chaos, all sorts of other things. If we don't have those ground systemic knowledge systems, I would suggest, cybernetics as well, with much of the data and the AI, where we are going to find ourselves with quite a lot of challenges that we then need to be reactive to rather than proactive.
Thanks, Catherine. Yeah, I'd like to kind of also just re-emphasize your first point, because it was a really interesting point that the profile of water research and innovation within the national discussion, within our institutions, in government, that actually talks to its importance. It talks to its attraction for people to lean and be involved, the leadership from our kind of key institutions to drive that, and also then the ability to organise around those needs is really critical. It's a really good litmus test, and I think we've got a challenge because a lot of those discussions are oriented around conflict at the moment, rather than around innovation and research. So it's an interesting challenge, I think, to achieving that. What is a really important step? Yeah, interesting. Karen, have you got something to add there?
Yes, I was certainly the question about the cross-transboundary skills and cross-sectoral skills and the need to build capability that is able to support research in those areas and ongoing the implementation of solutions in those areas, I think will be critical. I did want to make the point that I don't see water as similar to some of the other sectors. It's not like agriculture or defence. We need to recognise its uniqueness and potentially it needs a unique approach. And as Catherine was talking, I was thinking of a successful initiative that I've seen done in South Australia, which was around health in all policies. And I could see this as water in all research programs. And I know that some of the things that have gone into the chat have been around, well, how do we fund this? Everyone seems to agree it's really important and maybe we should be levying water users. And maybe we need to think more broadly about that. So if we do think about, say, water in agriculture, it's fairly obvious and clear, but water in defence, we've had various interactions at Water RA with defence for all kinds of reasons. For example, they have an awful lot of wastewater treatment plants, more than 100 wastewater treatment plants, defence own and operate. Who knew? That's bigger than any water utility in the country, just as an example. So I do think we need to recognise water as unique. It's a human right. We still have some challenges around that, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. We still have some challenges around water and sanitation and access to acceptable water in all parts of Australia for all Australians. So I think to think of water as unique, it enables all economic activity and supports for a healthy environment. There is an opportunity with the review of R&D in Australia that was launched in the last budget, and they will be sometime in the immediate future, I believe, seeking submissions about what needs to change in Australia's R&D funding system. And I think this is an opportunity if we can put our minds together and come up with some examples of how this could be taken forward. It would be perhaps the right time and good timing for water to come back and be more central in the agenda. So that's my hope and my positive statement for the future.
No, thanks, Karen. And I almost want to end the webinar right now because it was a good place to end. But I do want to hear from from Seth, Brad, and Guy. But we're running up to time, so maybe we keep it reasonably short. Seth, maybe from you, what's your addition, final word on this?
Look, I think I agree with what's said, and I think we do need a national strategy for water. And it's not just a monolithic sort of funding organisation. I think it really does need to look at all the institutions and all the mechanisms that are involved and how they do or don't pull together. I think one of the key elements of that would be the why, and really making the why critical. For me, that's really 4 distinct things. It's kind of addressing these grand societal challenges. I think is critical. Whether it's climate change, closing the gap, all those other dimensions. I think there's stuff around innovation, economic growth, and how water supports that, and that sort of links to how it enables all these other sectors as well, mining, agriculture, so forth. I think one thing we haven't talked about too much is the workforce, or we have actually in a few contexts of that workforce development, but the role of training students, not just PhD students, but undergraduates across the board, for this industry, and making it, an industry of choice. And the final thing is this idea of public trust and facilitating societal discourse. And that came out really clearly yesterday in that COVID report, where the role of independence and research and how important that is, in a different context, but for engendering public trust during a crisis, really came through in that report. And I think really recognising the importance of research and those sort of values of independence, transparency, and so on that come along with it is really critical.
Thanks, Seth. It's fresh. And I want to let Brad finish off. So, Guy, do you want to, if you go first, and then I'll hand to Brad to finish off.
Well, to be brief, ditto, I guess. We had a decade of land here quite a long time ago, when it's time for the decade of water innovation. And we're not alone. We could do it globally. We need to look to new partnerships, need some national leadership. What is We have water reforms, water infrastructure, basin plans, catchment plans, and RD&E will only be a small part of the big agenda. 1 or 2 or 3%, that's all it needs to be. Total expenditure, but that's what we need.
Thanks, Guy. And Brad, last words from you?
My list of demands. I suppose it's, moving to a space where co-design with Indigenous people and, Indigenous research methodologies are a key part of looking at how we manage water and also the landscape. Caring for country comes to mind, and obviously, Indigenous rangers are doing a hell of a great job in making country look better. And I suppose it's how do we support them, as a cohort in this space to build them, potentially offer academic pathways, and that's up to universities as well, where I'm at. So, it's my current thinking as well. The funding for research, other than, ARC grants, is not there for Indigenous scholars in water, in climate change. They are there in the health space, but I suppose this space is very much lacking. It's always lacked. And then obviously, look towards an Indigenous research body itself, a centre of excellence or a CRC or I think a NEST 3.0, and then we can build a strategy to obviously fill that void. We saw this unfold with the fish kills and the barker. The fish kills 2.0 in the last, 4 years, and, no one wanted to take responsibility, but the Barkindji knew what was happening, but they were helpless in regard to stopping that black water and all those fish deaths. So I suppose there was failures all around, and I suppose, if they're in a position that potentially is respected, then that they can we can get to the point where they're at the coalface and they can actually start doing things. So, there's opportunities abound, but I suppose they're very sporadic and very small in that regard. So I'm hoping for a better water research world and obviously more Indigenous researchers in this space because it's lateral.
No, thanks, Brett. Appreciate that. Look, thanks very much to the panel. We have had a question come through. It said, but what about answering the question, is Australia's R&D capacity fit for purpose? I mean, I think I would have to say that the answer was no across the board. That would be my conclusion from what I'm hearing, that there is fragmentation. Some of those partnerships that have been tailored for the needs of the past, that have built longevity of relationships and all the benefits that go with that we've talked about, do not exist. I mean, we're lucky within the One Basin CRC, there's an exception, but it's just one exception. And so we need new arrangements that are fit for purpose for the future challenges. They won't look like the ones of the past. They need to deal with the sort of the complexity of the way these challenges interact, the speed at which issues are emerging, the challenges, of realizing your aspiration, Brad, of that co-design with First Nations becomes a common practice. That these are all new things we need to really kind of double down on to design that system, and we're not going to obviously solve that here. But I think there is a window over the next couple of years where there's a couple of different things happening within government that give us an opportunity to shape what this might look like over the next 10 years, and really pleased that we've had this discussion as a starting point for that. Now we're almost out of time. Before we finish, I wanted to thank all of you. I want to highlight there's a survey coming up. Also to point out the One Basin CRC has just released a number of podcasts that deal with this topic. They're case studies of successful research to impact. The link for those podcasts is in the chat. I think it's up the top. Maybe it's going to be reposted somewhere near down the bottom of the chat. Really thank you everyone for participating. I apologize, I haven't got to all the questions. I've done my best, and hopefully we've addressed at least a good proportion of them. And thanks again to our panelists.